Air tonight, actually, with breaking news as the Prime Minister has announced that he will resign. We are getting continued reaction tonight to the announcement by the Prime Minister because, of course, this is historic. Now the leadership race is going to begin, and that is going to have a number of questions as well, a lot of contenders potentially. We already see one contender, a former MP who has announced that he will be running. And there's a lot of questions as well surrounding what comes next for the party and for the country. The Prime Minister told reporters earlier today in his announcement that he told his family of his decision last night when they were having dinner together, and then just really a few hours later is when he made the announcement to the rest of the country. Now, sources have told me that Chrystia Freeland, the former Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister, who of course made a very public kind of backlash against the Prime Minister just a few short weeks ago when she announced that she would step down from her role as Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister over the Prime Minister not taking some of these issues seriously enough. She has been reportedly calling people over the course of the weekend. Sources also telling me Mark Carney has been working the phones, and I guess the key difference is Chrystia Freeland has really been relying on people and calling people within the Liberal Party caucus, whereas Mark Carney has been reaching beyond that. Let's bring in Steve Paikin now. He's host of The Agenda on TVOs. Steve, really appreciate your time.
Wyatt, apologies for not dressing up, but when I'm not on the air, this is how I tend to dress when I'm just working out of my office. So sorry. Not meant to indicate any disrespect for your show.
No worries at all. I want to begin by just asking you, obviously, this news came not necessarily as a surprise. I think it was perhaps a little bit earlier than a lot of people were expecting, for sure. But in terms of what we know, I mean, I was saying to one person, it's almost playing out in a similar way to Dalton McGuinty and kind of what he and how he announced his resignation, in the sense of Justin Trudeau said that he will stay on as Liberal Party leader until a new one is chosen. What do you make of kind of what we should expect to play out over the course of the next few months?
I must confess, when I first heard the news, it was not Dalton McGuinty and the way in which he left office that came to mind. It was much more the current Prime Minister's father. You weren't alive for when this happened, but I was, and I remember back in February of 1984 that Pierre Trudeau was a very unpopular Prime Minister who famously went for a walk in the snow and then came to the realization that he had to leave the job. Justin Trudeau didn't go for a walk in the snow, but he went skiing on the snow out in British Columbia, and similarly, after finishing up that trip, came to the conclusion that he couldn't continue. So snow was a very common motif between the two of them. As I recall, Dalton McGuinty came one seat short of a majority government in that third term of his, which would have been the 2011 election. And yes, he got into trouble with some gas plant stuff, and yes, he prorogued the legislature in order to avoid, I'm not sure it was a non-confidence vote, but it was certainly studied by a committee, a legislative committee of the gas plant story. It was pretty messy by the end. And I guess in that respect, the comparison works. So sure.
And I guess, too, if we're talking about kind of the impact that Chrystia Freeland will have on the Liberal Party, but then how some of the other candidates might come into play and some leadership contenders, because obviously Chrystia Freeland now has the benefit of knowing a lot of people within the caucus, because the other two people whose names you're hearing floated around quite often, there's kind of the big three, are Mark Carney and then, of course, Christy Clark as well. How much do you think kind of that caucus connection, so to speak, will benefit her?
Hard to say, only for this reason. The question I think Canadians are asking themselves right now is, were the Liberals at 17 points in the polls because we couldn't stand the Liberal Party of Canada, or because we couldn't stand Justin Trudeau? If it was the latter, if it was the Liberals are very unpopular anytime pollsters survey because we just have had it with the current Prime Minister, then if the Prime Minister is no longer there and somebody else is put in his stead, the potential for the Liberal Party to become more popular and more competitive with the Conservatives, I would suggest, is there. And Wyatt, again, you're going to forgive me for doing this, but I go back and look at history and find two other examples just at the top of my head of prime ministers who left under a real cloud, very unpopular, Pierre Trudeau being one, Brian Mulroney being the other. Canadians asked themselves, was it the party we hated or was it the leader we hated? Well, it turned out it was the leader they didn't like. Because when Pierre Trudeau left, John Turner came in 1984, and the Liberal Party immediately went from last place to first place in the polls. And I can do the same thing in 1993 when Brian Mulroney retired I think it was the winter of 1993. Kim Campbell took over. She did a bit of a barbecue circuit over the summer, and she got the then old PC party into first place in the polls. So I'm not saying that's what will happen this time, but I'm saying I've seen this happen twice before in the last 40 years, where a party replaces its leader, gets rebranded with a new leader who brings maybe fresh policies, some fresh energy, and suddenly they're very competitive once again. Could that happen this time? Well, given that it's happened twice in my lifetime already, I would say, yeah, it's possible.
And what do you make of just if we're going into, this idea of another election soon, and then the fact that the Liberals are going to have more time perhaps than they initially expected, given the Prime Minister has said he's going to prorogue Parliament now. But it's still, I mean, it reminds me almost of what we saw in August in the United States with the Vice President kind of being slotted in at the last moment, where a lot of party strategists now say they believe she didn't have enough time to introduce herself. Is, a Chrystia Freeland or a Christy Clark or a Mark Carney or even a Melanie Joly going to have enough time to introduce themselves to the electorate?
Well, okay, I'm going to do the same thing again, which is I'm going to take an example from history and say, I don't know if it will happen this time, but it's happened before and it could happen again. January 2018, Patrick Brown steps down as the leader of the Ontario PC party. Doug Ford announces he wants the job. 3-month leadership campaign takes place. He wins the job. 3 months after that, he's the Premier of Ontario. Now, before that, 6-7 months earlier, Doug Ford was a private citizen. He wasn't on city council anymore. He was thinking about running for mayor. Suddenly, he's the Premier of Ontario. Now he's the 2-term Premier of Ontario, potentially thinking about, running for a 3rd term this year, as he may or may not do. We'll see. I think the point is that, all bets are off. There are a lot of people making some very foolish predictions right now, and I don't know what the value of these predictions are. I think the reality is that if the Liberal Party in general and Liberal Party policy has been a huge part of the problem, and not just Justin Trudeau over the past year or two, then anybody who is in his cabinet and or caucus is going to have a hard time explaining why they supported all of these policies that the public apparently has now had it with. Whereas you mentioned Christy Clark, you mentioned Mark Carney, neither of the two of them are tied to anything that's transpired over the past 9.5 years or so that Justin Trudeau's been Prime Minister. 9 years and 2 months, I guess, not quite 9.5 years. So to me, that's the big thing I'm watching for. I'm watching to see whether Canadians, once Justin Trudeau has truly left the job, once they're prepared to give the Liberal Party a new shake, or whether they've just had it with the Liberal Party and with Justin Trudeau, and the next election's a foregone conclusion. I don't know which way it's going to go, and I'm not going to make any predictions on it because I don't think predictions are worth that much.
And if we're talking about the policy, because you mentioned it there briefly, obviously one of the most controversial policies of this federal government was the carbon tax, and that's kind of what Pierre Poilievre is branding his entire message on right now. How hard would it be for some of these leadership candidates to make kind of a reversal or a switch on not even just an issue as substantial as that, but also perhaps some of the smaller issues that the Trudeau government has come out with stances on that a lot of people, including the Conservatives, have been criticizing?
Well, Wyatt, I'd say the same thing. I'd say if you weren't part of the cabinet and or caucus of the past 9 years, like Christy Clark, like Mark Carney, I think you've got a much better opportunity to say, hey, look, I didn't have anything to do with that. That wasn't my policy. I didn't run on it. I didn't get elected on it. I didn't vote for it. Under my leadership, in fact, we're going to take a different approach. They can certainly do that with a lot more political legitimacy, and it's a more defensible position than, say, anybody who was in the cabinet or caucus who would now want to run for leader and will have to explain to not just Liberal Party voters who are going to pick the next leader, but to the Canadian public in general. I thought this then, but I think this now. That's a harder nut to crack. So to me, that's a big advantage for the Carneys and for the Clarks of the world. But again, a smart politician can figure out a way to say, yeah, I supported it then. I thought it worked, but I've heard the voices of Canadians and they don't want it. And so I'm prepared to take another approach. I supported the party then when it took that approach. because I was loyal to my leader. But the leader is gone, and it offers us a fresh chance to take a look at issues all over again. You know, if somebody's a skilled politician, they can make that work. So again, those are going to be some of the things I'm going to be watching for in the days and months ahead.
All right, we'll leave our conversation there. Steve Paikin, thank you so much.
Good enough. Happy to be with you, Wyatt.
I want to bring in Cameron Amati, served as head of communications for Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Cameron, really good to see you. Thanks so much.
Great to see you, Wyatt. Thanks for having me.
Of course. I want to begin by just kind of asking you about the process and about the announcement itself by the Prime Minister, because he said that, he told his family just last night when they were having dinner. And obviously, there's a lot of talk in the media and everything about what this means politically speaking, but also for him and kind of his legacy and where it will go from here. You worked for him. I guess, what do you expect him politically to be remembered for? I mean, he touched on it a little bit in his speech as well.
That's a big question to ask, and one that's going to be hard to know the long-term answer to right now because he's been in office for a really long time, for longer than most leaders usually spend in office, and through some of the most crazy times, frankly, that our society has seen in living memory. So the way I'm starting to think about it is in two categories. On one hand, there were these crises, these unforeseen events that really dominated so much of his time in office. Obviously, the pandemic and those dark years that he led the country through. And I think people really appreciated the leadership that he showed and the supports that the government was able to provide really quickly. Of course, there was Trump's first term in office. There was the renegotiation of NAFTA. There was the tariffs, the threat of all the things Trump was imposing on us. And then, of course, more recently, there was the war in Ukraine, which he showed global leadership on. But on top of that, and as a progressive, I think there's so much that he has led, not obviously not all perfectly, and many things we can look back that we would have done differently. But economically speaking, focusing on working people, trying to tilt the odds in the favor of working people and regular families, often at the expense of the wealthiest few and the most polluting companies, whether it's on a climate plan, whether it's on childcare and affordable spaces for families, whether it's on affordable dental care. And I think a lot of these things won't necessarily be felt right away. They might take some years for people to feel. So time will tell. But I think once we get through this period where everybody's focused on the political intrigue and the next election coming up, maybe a few years down the road, there will be a lot to look at in terms of accomplishments from Mr. Trudeau.
And I mean, you mentioned yourself as a progressive. Obviously, now we're going to be heading into a leadership race. What do you yourself want to see in terms of how long, perhaps some of the contenders who might emerge, etc.?
Well, hopefully, I think the most important thing is that the party has a really open, democratic, broad process that involves as many people as possible. That's just really important for the country, for the party, especially after 10 years having the same leader who built a strong movement and people really got involved because of him in many respects. Now is the time for renewal, and now is the time for all these candidates to reach out, not just to existing liberals, but to new people who might be liberals or who just don't agree with the conservative right-wing vision of Polyev, but who want to see an alternative, who maybe wanted a change in leadership, but really liked a lot of the policies, or think that climate change matters and don't and know the NDP doesn't have a plan. Like there are a lot of people out there, I think, who could be involved, and that's what a leadership race is really good at doing, as long as it stays respectful and as long as everybody remembers that they're on the same team.
And yeah, that's certainly something that happens in leadership races in terms of even looking at the Conservative Party leadership race or some recent provincial ones in terms of division within the party. And so I guess to follow up on that specifically, we saw, as MPs were coming out, as the Deputy Prime Minister released her statement, or I guess the former Deputy Prime Minister released her statement, they were calling on the Prime Minister to resign, but they did so in a fairly respectful way. But nonetheless, it obviously created some internal issues within the party itself. As we go forward into a leadership race, obviously, there's a lot of kind of commentary right now that the next leader of the Liberal Party will, in essence, almost be the Kim Campbell of the Liberal Party because of what the polls are suggesting.
Yeah.
How does the Liberal Party kind of stay united as we move into this next phase? And then, as you know, Pierre Poilievre is likely to assume government, how does the Liberal Party focus on rebuilding and perhaps creating new messaging that can resonate with Canadians in the same way it seems Pierre Poilievre's messaging is resonating right now?
That's a really great question. And I don't think I'll have the answers to it. And frankly, progressive parties, a lot of centrist parties around the world have struggled with this in recent years, right? With the rise of very successful populist right-wing movements who are great at messaging, who've harnessed online tools, and they've done this over years. We just saw it in the United States. So I think there's a lot of work and a lot of catch up to do, and it might not be done by the next election. But to answer one part of your question, it's really important for the party to stay united and for everyone to remember that they're on the same team, especially now that there's this opportunity for renewal and, starting fresh, going into the next election. But to the other part of your question about messaging and about how to connect with people, it's forgetting about all the language and the trappings of government and just talking to people about what's going on in their lives and laying out really clearly what they're offering versus what the other side's offering. That's what communications is all about, is speaking to people in language they understand, that they can relate to, about the problems they're facing, and then telling them how you're going to help solve them. And in many cases, the government or the Liberal government has done things that aren't objectively popular, but it hasn't necessarily resonated for various reasons. Whereas on the other side, you have a Conservative Party that really good at tapping into why people are angry and sort of resonating with them about that anger. But if you look at the solutions they're offering, they're not really profound. They're not thought through, and people wouldn't really agree with what might happen, like cutting programs or abandoning climate action. So that's where the party needs to stay focused and just remember who you're talking to, what is at stake, what matters, and why you're actually going to help them.
All right, we'll leave it there. Cameron Ahmad, thank you so much.
Thanks, Wyatt, and congratulations to you for everything that you're doing, and I hope you keep it up.
Joining me now to discuss this is former Liberal MP Dan McTeague. Dan, thanks so much.
Good to be here, Wyatt. Thanks for having me.
Of course. I want to begin just by asking you about kind of the rebrand that whoever becomes the next leader of the Liberal Party is kind of bound to want to do. And a lot of that will probably be in relation to the carbon tax, because, of course, that's a very kind of controversial policy, if you will, that the Prime Minister himself has introduced. Is that even possible at this point, though, for someone who, because most of the people who you're seeing, kind of these top 10 people who are vying to replace Justin Trudeau, at least speculation, they have in many ways been kind of attached to the Prime Minister, whether it be in his cabinet or whether it be through fundraising. Is there any way for them to distance themselves at this point, or are they kind of attached to these types of issues?
Well, I don't think they have a lot of time. My recollection of the party constitution was 90 days or so to have a leadership convention. It's now 70 some odd days to March the 24th. So I don't think it gives a lot of room or latitude for those who are planning to mount a campaign. And that certainly would probably exclude those who are not insiders. But short of the period of time, which looks to be less favorable to those trying to mount a campaign from the outside, comes, of course, the reality that they're really tarred with the same brush. All of them will have to, in one way or another, in one form or another, account for their tenure under Justin Trudeau, or more importantly, try to present themselves as completely different. An analogy I would give is one my grandfather would have given to me. It's not just a question of changing, it's a question of jacking up the rad cap and replacing a whole new vehicle under it. There's no way you can do that in such a short period of time. So I suspect that this is really about, a leadership that would be more of a custodial leadership. That is to say that they are prepared to spend the next 2 to 4 terms out of government and in opposition, rebuilding the party and redefining its brand. Because it's not just the leadership that's been hurt. It's the brand of the Liberal Party that has been badly damaged by this procrastination by not just the Prime Minister, who has resigned today, but also by a caucus that didn't act when it could have acted to avert what now appears to be collateral damage for the entire Liberal Party in its name as well as in its form.
Yeah, and I mean, if we're looking at it from kind of what they need to do moving forward, obviously there's some scenarios like what happened in 2011 where Michael Ignatieff, did not do as strong a job as he needed to, putting it kind of plainly. But then just
Tell me
four
about
years,
it.
but then just 4 years later, Justin Trudeau surged to victory and won a very large majority government, and they were able to bounce back very quickly. But then if you look provincially, from Kathleen Wynne in 2018, in 2022, the Liberal Party's kind of effect, it remained, and Stephen Del Duca didn't do well. The polls are suggesting Bonnie Crombie won't do that well. So, what do you make of kind of this idea, and how long might it take them to bounce back from this? Obviously, Justin Trudeau's been the prime minister now for 10 years, and so people are in many ways feeling kind of apathetic, it would seem.
The Liberal Party recovery in 2015 was nothing short of meteoric, and the only reason it happened is because of the last name. The Liberal Party needed a couple of terms out of office in order to rebuild itself, define itself, as opposed to whatever the flavor of the day was. And we'll recall the Prime Minister's swearing in his first presence before the Governor General's coming out doing his interview, saying, "Well, because it's 2015." Well, the party is much deeper than that, and its policies have deviated substantially from the traditions of the Pearson, even senior Trudeau, of balanced consensus forming, striving to help the middle class, but also importantly to guard ourselves against affordability issues, which have become paramount. It's not by accident. President Canadians for affordable energy, but you saw this coming. I saw this coming, and many as well, those of us who've been in the party. And I'm not talking my 18 years as a Liberal member of Parliament. I mean, I spent a good 20 years before that in the trenches of the party, helping other Liberal members of Parliament get elected, helping riding associations, attending every convention. The fact is, the Liberal Party probably needed a little bit more time out. Instead, it got what I think was a quick, instant sugar fix with Justin Trudeau. It was able to cling to power, hold to power, merge to the far left, engage in cultural identity, politics of division. And I think in that respect, unfortunately for the Liberal Party, it's going to take 2 to 3 to 4 terms maybe before it can get back to fighting another election. Goodness knows what's going to happen in 10 to 15 years from now. But at that's probably the best case scenario. The worst case scenario, Liberal Party disappears as an entity and becomes merged with the NDP, or simply disappears from relevance and remains a little bit like, I don't know, the 1970s, 1980s Social Credit Party.
And this is something that really struck me is as I was watching some of the commentary today on some of the mainstream news channels, you had these political strategists who were, talking about how this is a really tough time for members of parliament and stuff. And, I was thinking to myself about it in the sense of, I don't think Canadians who are unable to put food on the table, for example, are thinking about how hard of a time this is for members of parliament. And, that's just something that I personally felt. But does that speak to this idea that a lot of people in Ottawa are too focused on pleasing people kind of within the Ottawa bubble, so to speak, and not necessarily realizing the impact? And perhaps is that how we got to this exact moment?
Well, it is, I think, very certain that members of Parliament have behaved over the past year and a half in a way that would show that they were completely detached from the signals that were coming from the ground up. In July of 2023, when we saw a crushing, numbers coming from the polling, that should have been evidence in of itself to those who are pundits. But for those who are, supposedly their ear very close to the ground, that is the members of Parliament, they weren't paying a lot of attention and really were ignoring the plight, the concerns that Canadians were expressing, because I heard it, and I heard it just in my former role. People were genuinely disappointed, wanted a change, but most importantly, wanted a change in policy and direction. Instead, they're left with, large numbers of people attending food banks, people who come to this country believing that it would be a better place. It's not. There has been a concern about security in our communities. There has been a concern about the ability to make ends meet. Young people have not been able to get work for the very first time in many, many generations. The problems are ubiquitous. And while all of them cannot be laid at the feet of the government, the reality is the government's response has been, very short, very ineloquent, and I think significantly detached from where average ordinary people have been for the past year and a half. So no wonder this day should have happened a year ago. The fact that it hasn't spells real trouble for the Liberal Party, no matter who the leader is in the forthcoming days.
And just lastly here, before we conclude, obviously part of Pierre Poilievre's brand over the course of the past few years now has been about Justin Trudeau. You know, even in the post that he made today, in essentially response to the Prime Minister's announcement, you know, he calls him Justin, and he uses a lot of these slogans that really are effective in terms of political messaging. What does that mean, though, for the Conservatives that they're now going to go up against somebody else, and how might that person who they end up going up against change their messaging to try and disassociate themselves from Justin Trudeau?
It's a John Turner, Kim Campbell moment. I mean, they're going to be tarred with the same brush, but most importantly, the policies that are going to be affecting people. Look, the Liberal Party comes back to the House of Commons on the 24th, Monday, the 24th of March. Within a week of that, we have an increase in the carbon taxes of 4 to 5 cents a liter, and propane, diesel, gasoline, natural gas, all that is going to go up. So unless the new leader is coming in saying, I'm scrapping this from day one, of course, assuming that they can actually win a confidence vote, which may be too little too late, my suspicion is that the Liberal Party is going to have a hard time even passing a mandatory financial instruments that's been delaying in terms of a budget, and it has obviously put off for obvious reasons, which brought us to this point. They're firing Chrystia Freeland, or her leaving, or resignation, call it what it is. The reality is that the government is running on fumes, and not just politically, but likely financially and economically. And as a result, we could be in for some very serious times that will parallel the chaotic situation we find ourselves in, save and except and until there's an election called in this country in which 40 million Canadians or less or more should have the ability to make a determination. Until that happens, I think many Canadians are going to be very skeptical of whatever the Liberal Party does. It's too little, it's too late. And unfortunately for Liberals, time is up.
All right, we'll leave our conversation there. Dan McTeague, thank you so much.
Always a pleasure, Wyatt. Thanks for having me.
I want to bring in New Brunswick Liberal MP Wayne Long to discuss this more. Wayne, thanks so much for being here.
Happy to be on your show, Wyatt.
Let me just start out. You were one of the Liberal MPs who called for the Prime Minister to step down. Are you comfortable with this idea that he's going to stay on as Prime Minister? Because obviously some people are saying that that could, you know, further kind of tarnish the reputation of the party.
Yeah, I'm perfectly fine with it. I mean, we will obviously embark in a leadership contest, whether it's 8 weeks, 9 weeks, or 10 weeks. You know, I think we can certainly pull off a leadership contest before we go back after prorogation. I'm perfectly fine with the leader staying on as an interim leader, what have you, the Prime Minister staying on. And then, you know, we'll start fresh with a new leader, new throne speech, new vision, and, you know, a chance to really offer an alternative to Canadians to compete against the Pierre Poilievre government.
And obviously the next question is kind of about the leadership race and people wondering who could potentially throw their hat into the ring. And I've been asking some of my guests about this over the course of the show. And that's just about, you know, some of the issues that are, you know, kind of tarnishing the Liberal brand right now. You know, Pierre Poilievre often talks about the carbon tax as one example. I just talked to another Liberal MP who said that he doesn't think the carbon tax is an issue that is kind of pulling the Liberals back right now. So I guess I'm just curious to get your take on that as well, in the sense of what is it that's holding the Liberals back, and then what does a new leader need to do to perhaps kind of rectify that?
I think what's holding the Liberals back is, you know, typically, you know, they always used to joke the Liberals run in the left and govern in the middle. And we've certainly swung our party more to the left progressive side, and I think we need to get ourselves back to the center. I'm for one that would like to review the carbon tax. I think that, you know, if you take a page out of Doug Ford's book, you know, Doug Ford is straight up apologized and said he got a few things wrong. And I don't think there's anything wrong with us really ripping the Band-Aid off and saying, look, let's review some of the policies, some of the divisive policies. And, you know, the carbon tax would be one of them, where I think we could come up with a better plan, maybe an industrial tax, but not a direct consumer tax. And, you know, I think we're to the stage now where we have to stop the moral authority that we're right in everything. We need to stop lecturing Canadians and really start to govern from where Canadians want us to be. There's a big vacuum in the middle, the political middle of our country. And I think that's where we need to get back to attract more voters.
We're seeing right now, obviously, Chrystia Freeland is someone who is reportedly making kind of hitting the phones. Obviously, Mark Carney, Christy Clark, a long kind of list of people. And of course, this is all speculation at this point.
Of course.
But whoever that person is it possible for them to reverse their position on something like the carbon tax in a meaningful way? Because obviously they can do it, but will it resonate with Canadians? Because obviously a lot of Canadians will make the argument that folks like Chrystia Freeland were alongside the Prime Minister when he introduced something like that.
I think there's nothing wrong with now taking a step back and saying, look, we recognize that Canadians are hurting. And although we believe in the price and pollution, we didn't sell it well. We didn't market it and promote it to Canadians effectively. And we lost that war. The old adage, if you don't control the message controls you. Well, that message that the AXA tax and the carbon tax is a bad thing sadly became reality in the minds of a lot of Canadians. No, there's absolutely nothing wrong now saying, look, best intentions, we did bring carbon emissions down, but we're going to look at another way to go at it. And we're going to, maybe tax some heavy emitters, more of an industrial-based tax. I mean, if you look at people like Andrew Furey, Susan Holt, Wab Canoe, they're all basically questioning the validity of the carbon tax. Mark Carney himself now has come out and said that the consumer price has kind of come and gone. So no, there's nothing wrong whatsoever with reviewing some policies and saying, look, we're going to offer a different version, a different style of policy to Canadians. I mean, I think Canadians, Wyatt, see that as authentic. And that's what's been missing in a lot of our Liberal politics.
You mentioned Susan Holt, the New Brunswick Premier. She was on the show a little while ago talking about the Trump tariff threat. And I want to ask you, because the Prime Minister and, the Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland, who at the time in 2017, throughout kind of the first Trump trade war, was really at the front and center. Do you worry that the resignation of the Prime Minister could perhaps prompt some political instability that might allow the President-elect to take advantage, perhaps, of Canada?
No. We've got great bones and a great foundation in the Liberal Party, great ministers, great negotiators. And, look, I mean, President Trump mocked and taunted Justin Trudeau today of all days. So that relationship is clearly not a good relationship. Sadly, the president doesn't have a lot of respect for the Prime Minister. So we certainly aren't any better off or worse off with Justin Trudeau resigning. We have challenges for the United States. It's not going to be a short-term play. It's going to be a 4-year administration, and we're going to have to state our case and show the Americans that we're partners. We're not adversaries.
All right, we'll leave it there. Liberal MP Wayne Long, thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me on your show.
I want to bring in journalist Jackson Gosnell to discuss this more, who is joining us from the United States. Jackson, the president-elect was very quick to post kind of his disregards almost to the prime minister, which is kind of unconventional. Usually in this type of a situation, you would expect the president-elect to, thank the prime minister for his service or for what he's done, for some of the things that they were able to work together on. But of course, it comes as there's a very intense kind of trade battle going on back and forth between the United States and Canada right now as well. What is kind of the reaction in the United States to this news that the Prime Minister is going to be resigning?
Well, Wyatt, it's good to be with you. I think the reaction is one that was to be expected. Reporting has suggested this for days, and I think the American people tuned into that. As far as the tariff argument that you bring up, I think the American people are looking forward to lower prices and the potential that would happen. Now, it may be at the cost of other countries, but I don't think the average American particularly is too worried about that. Donald Trump won the election decisively and very largely, and as a result of that, I think the American people are wanting an economy that they remember from a few years ago when he was in charge. And whatever that looks like, whether it's tariffs, whether it's negotiating with other countries, no matter the case, I think people have signed up for that in this last election. But more importantly, I think that these tariff arguments are more of a negotiating tactic by the president-to-be, the president-elect Donald Trump. I don't particularly expect him to impose actual 25% tariffs on Mexico, as well as Canada and other countries. I think this is more so for leveraging power. We saw the dinner at Mar-a-Lago where now Prime Minister who's resigned, Trudeau, had dinner with President Trump, and he then referred to him as the governor of the 51st state, sort of nodding to the fact that Canada receives a lot from the United States and so forth.
Yeah, well, I think it's fair to say, I mean, people heard from New Brunswick Premier Susan Holden in a previous episode of the show in, her saying that she wouldn't be opposed to retaliatory tariffs. So you have the Ontario Premier Doug Ford saying he wouldn't be opposed to cutting off electricity to border states as well. And so, I think a lot of people are wondering kind of going forward whether or not the president-elect is even going to move forward with some of these tariffs because of what Canada is proposing in kind of retaliation to what we're seeing here. We do know, though, that Justin Trudeau was kind of cooperative with the Biden administration. And despite some disagreements, whether it be Keystone XL or what have you, they still shared, a number of policies on economic issues, and they were both relatively progressive individuals. But the Liberal Party in Canada is still going to be in power for the next few months here, which means that the president-elect is going to have to deal with someone at the opposite end of the political spectrum. How should we kind of expect that to play out?
I think it will be robust action on the behalf of the United States. Look, the American people signed up in November for somebody who is not afraid to say exactly what he thinks, whether people see it as right or wrong. The Biden administration was very much complacent with a lot that happens. I don't think that's a political talking point. I think that's just the reality. We saw the president here in the United States' decline over the last few months, and I think that's why ultimately Joe Biden was swapped out for Kamala Harris. So as far as the relationship between Trudeau and the Bidens, of course it was going to work well. President Biden was not somebody who drew a hard line and took a decisive stance against something, but the American people apparently have missed that, and that's why they've reelected Donald Trump. I expect it to be aggressive. I do think they'll work together and exchange pleasantries, among other things, just as we saw in the first term. But I also think that there is going to be some hard conversations. There's going to be some political power at use. And I think, sure, they'll work together. I mean, the U.S. and Canada are each other's border country, and they work closely with a lot of goods going from country to country. So I don't expect the relationship to just be demolished, but I certainly think there's going to be pressure on Canada. There may be pressure on the U.S. as well, but I believe they'll be able to work together.
And just lastly here, before we conclude, the president-elect has talked about, as you mentioned, making Canada the 51st state. In Canada, just to kind of tell you this, it is not being well received by anybody on any end of the political spectrum, and that includes our Conservative Party leader, Pierre Poilievre, who many people in the United States are actually celebrating, calling him Trump 2.0, saying phrases like "Make Canada Great Again" now as well. Even he is against this idea of making Canada the 51st state. Is the president-elect in for some type of a, surprise when, Pierre Poilievre gets elected in a few months and all of a sudden now he's negotiating with someone who's just as tough as he is?
I don't think he's in for a surprise. Look, I think a lot of people blew that well out of proportion. I've been covering Donald Trump for years, and I'm not going to be an apologist for him, but I also think I would be doing the audience a disservice if I didn't tell you that a lot of what he says is just theater and talking points. I don't think that Donald Trump has any expectation that Canada is going to become the 51st state. He may talk about that. He may talk about 25% tariffs, but this guy is somebody who says whatever the heck is on his mind that day, but he's doing it with purpose, and I think we'll see that play out. I think this is more of his way of getting his point across, that he thinks the U.S. isn't getting a fair deal as it relates to Canada all the time. But I don't think that he actually believes that we're adding another star to our flag. And so I don't think he's going to be shocked at all to go up against somebody who's just as tough as him.
All right, we will leave our conversation there. Jackson Gosnell, thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Wyatt.
Let's welcome in former Ontario Premier Kathleen Wynne now to discuss the latest. Premier, thanks so much for joining us.
Nice to see you, Wyatt.
Let me just start out because obviously the Prime Minister has done a lot of notable things that certainly his legacy will remember him for. Childcare, they're making advancements on pharmacare as well right now, but it would seem as if kind of the, I guess, ability for the party to win moving into the next election kind of superseded all of that. And obviously, it was started by Chrystia Freeland's letter, and then MPs over the course of the last few weeks writing letters to the prime minister as well. Let me just start out by asking you what you think the prime minister himself will be remembered for, because obviously he served for almost a decade.
Sure. Well, I think you've named some of the things that were really important. I think he has been a very consequential prime minister. I think that he moved boldly on climate action. He's ended the debate on childcare in the country. I mean, the program is just being finally rolled out now. But I think that he basically has made it clear that can be done. But I think the calls for him to step down started before Chrystia Freeland, Wyatt. I think that there was some disillusionment with his leadership, but what really ended his ability to carry on was Chrystia Freeland's letter. It didn't start with that, but the ability to carry on after that letter was written and after she laid out what she believed should be happening. It was impossible for him to continue, because then there were many MPPs on his team who were no longer supportive. I don't think that means that they were no longer supportive of what the government was doing, Wyatt. I think that they were looking at the issue politically and realized that with Justin Trudeau in the leadership, they could not possibly win an election.
And I mean, I just talked to someone who is the MP for the riding that you used to represent, Don Valley West, and Rob Oliphant, and he says that he believes that a lot of what Pierre Poilievre talks about in the sense of the carbon tax and some of these other issues actually is not what is causing the Liberals to be behind in the polls right now. Do you agree with that? And then I guess yourself, what do you think is causing the Conservatives to have, in some cases, 200 seat projections in some of these polls?
I think that Pierre Poilievre has tapped into anger and anxiety in the Canadian population. I think that Justin Trudeau, who has a very optimistic view of the country and a very positive view of the policies that can make the country better, and he's acted on many of those. I think that people are feeling, in the post-COVID world, with inflation high and living costs high, that they need somebody to blame. And I think Pierre Poilievre has very successfully made Justin Trudeau that scapegoat. The reality of that situation is, I mean, I don't think that it's clear at all that it is Justin Trudeau's fault. That the cost of living has gone up. I think that Pierre Poilievre is making that case. And because people are anxious, because they are angry about a whole lot of things, he's been able to ride that wave into this strong lead in the polls.
And what do you think, whoever, because obviously we're seeing now, I think there's over 10, people, just if I'm thinking in my mind, who kind of in speculation could potentially throw their hat into the ring. Only one person officially has so far, in a former member of parliament. But whoever is elected as the next leader of the Liberal Party and therefore the next prime minister, what do they have to do to kind of rebuild the party in terms of preparing it so that it can be successful in what will likely be either, an April or at the latest May election?
Well, I think that whoever the person is going to have to distance themselves in some way from Justin Trudeau in some way. I don't know what that looks like, but they will have to pick a couple of policies, or they'll have to do something to demonstrate that they're not a continuation of Justin Trudeau's era. Somebody like Mark Carney coming in, he can make the argument that he hasn't been part of the government, but just about everybody else who's on the list, except for Christy Clark, just about everybody else has been part of the government. So it's a harder argument to make. So they'll have to do that. And I think the rebuilding, yes, there's a rebuild that has to happen between now and the election, but that's going to be a short period of time. I think the rebuilding happens after the election. the best case scenario, I think right now, is that there can be enough of a shift that the Liberals can end up in opposition after the next election, and shoot for government in the following election. So that's a tall order, but I think that's what whoever the leader is who comes in, I think that's what they're looking at.
All right, we will leave it there. Former Premier Kathleen Wynne, thank you so much.
Thanks, Wyatt. Take good care.
Let's bring in JJ McCullough. He is a political YouTuber and political columnist, and Sharon Carr is with us as well, partner at Sovereign Advisory and the former Deputy Chief of Staff to Bill Morneau. Hello to the both of you.
Hey, Wyatt.
Hi, Wyatt.
Sharon, let me start out with you just in terms of what you're hearing in terms of what the Liberal leadership race could look like. Obviously, there's a number of people who it's looking like will emerge as potential candidates. How soon might we see that? And then what might kind of the logistics of the leadership race look like?
So we've seen the first candidate come out, officially at least. Frank Baylis, who's a former MP from the Montreal area, came out earlier today. He's a successful businessman, and it's the first out the door to basically say, I want to do this. There are, of course, rumblings that we know, at least I've been hearing from inside of Liberal circles, that Chrystia Freeland is organizing, which has been pretty obvious the last several weeks. And then we've got Mark Carney. And then today we heard Dominic LeBlanc as well, who is the current finance minister. And you know what? There's other names like Francois-Philippe Champagne, Melanie Joly, Anita Anand, and more names will come out there. So I think let's give it I give it like 24 more hours. There's not a lot of leeway. So we'll hear more names come out.
JJ, let me ask you about someone who's also being floated, and that's Christy Clark, who's the former BC Premier. Obviously, you're from British Columbia. She has, like, both legislatively, but also just image-wise. I mean, she was part of centre-right Conservatives. I was reading an article from earlier today from back when the Conservative leadership race was going on, when she had not only endorsed Jean Charest, but even before that had said that she herself would consider maybe jumping into that race. So there's a lot of criticism, towards her right now, specifically just, people saying that she just wants to be prime minister and that's kind of the end of it. But what do you make of that portion of things? And perhaps are there any other candidates that you're watching?
Well, I mean, Christy Clark, I'm sorry to say, never really met a camera that she didn't like. I think she is a politician that likes a lot of attention. And she is, in a sort of very, I think, British Columbian way, kind of a sort of pan-ideological person talking to conservative audiences and likes to pretend to be a liberal when she's talking to liberal audiences. I think when you look at her governing record, it is more progressive than not. But, the idea that she can sort of be adopted by a federal party that I don't think she has very deep ties to, and in fact has gone out of her way to avoid sort of fostering deep ties to, because that would alienate the conservatives that she wants to be appealing to. So I don't think she's a very serious contender. I mean, she can't speak French either, which,
She's
like
learning.
it or not, seems to be
She's learning.
Pardon me? Yeah, I don't think the Liberal Party of Canada is going to elect somebody who, learned how to speak kind of half-hearted French in their 50s or 60s, however old she is. But no, I mean, I think that the names that have been cited are probably the names that we're going to be seeing in the contest. I think the question, though, is whether or not
there's a divide in caucus. They want, like, the caucus members in general who are supporting her would like it to be for her to be appointed. They want it to be a caucus vote where they can essentially bypass the Constitution, or at least they're saying that there's flexibility in the Constitution where caucus can vote, but there actually isn't. So it would be up to the executive, and ideally, I think when it comes to the most caucus support, yeah, it's probably her, but that's just default of what happened. I think you're definitely right in terms of what the public perception of it is. But if you heard the Prime Minister earlier today, he was pretty clear on stating that it had to be nationwide, competitive. And then he made the point of saying that Chrystia Freeland was by his side for 10 years on everything, which I think he's trying to Like, I think there's a little gamesmanship happening there. So
Let's bring in Anthony Kosh. He was a spokesperson to Conservative Party leader Pierre Poilievre. Liberal strategist Amanda Elvero is also with us, as is NDP strategist Kim Wright. Nice to see you all. Thank you so much.
Nice to see you too.
Amanda, let me just start out with you, because we knew, that this announcement was going to be coming. I think it came perhaps a little bit earlier than a lot of people going into kind of the holiday break were expecting. The Prime Minister, though, in his remarks talked a lot about his family, and then even touching a little bit on his legacy in response to some questions from reporters. What do you expect to kind of take shape over the course of the next few months, whether it be the leadership race or potentially an early election in April or May?
I think both of those things. I think a lot of leadership speculation, which, let's be honest, we've been talking about for weeks or maybe even months anyways. But that's going to ramp up. It'll ramp up in the next few days and weeks as the party lays out the rules for the leadership race and we start seeing who's going to throw their name in the hat. So I think that's going to take up a lot of space. And then I think there's going to be a lot of speculation around election call. Will this new leader have the shortest prime ministership in Canadian history? Will they sit in the chair for just a few weeks before we head to the polls? Or will they get a longer runway and have the ability to familiarize themselves, with being leader and have the country familiarize themselves with that leader before we actually head to the polls? So I think those are the two big questions that obviously people are waiting to have answered. And I think there's going to be a lot of speculation as we evolve into the next few weeks.
Anthony, Pierre Poilievre has kind of made a lot of his kind of messaging on Justin Trudeau and on this idea that Justin Trudeau is the carbon tax prime minister, and a lot of effective slogans from a communication standpoint that have really, it seems, resonated with Canadians, at least the polls suggest. How much is this kind of idea that now there's going to be a new candidate that he has to run against who, he won't really have a lot of time to assess given how kind of short notice it will be from the time that they're chosen as Liberal leader to the time that the election takes place, but how might this affect the Conservatives, this idea that they're going to be running against someone else?
Well, there's a few things. There's no doubt that a lot of the animosity that Canadian voters were feeling towards the Liberal Party at large was in large part a byproduct of frustration with the Prime Minister personally. But I think it breaks down into two sort of directions here. I think it's going to be very difficult for anybody who's a member of the current Liberal caucus, even if it's Chrystia Freeland, to try to and you see this in Mr. Poilievre's communications and a lot of the stuff that's coming from the Conservatives right now, sort of reinvent themselves and say, I stood by this guy for a decade, clapping and jumping up and down at every decision that he made, but now I'm a completely different person and I'm different from the Liberal Party that I supported for the last 10 years. Give me a second chance. If it's somebody from the outside, they don't have but then you got the only real front runner, I guess you could say, who's an outsider. As it currently stands, that might very well change, is Mark Carney, who was an unofficial or official economic advisor to the Prime Minister, made a point of supporting him and showing up at a lot of Liberal Party events. So I think that's sort of the difficulty here. And you see that even Poilievre put out a larger tweet even subsequent to the video that he initially released today, basically making that exact point, which is saying, don't fall for this. These guys were right up and walking in lockstep with Mr. Trudeau up until 5 minutes ago. They're not distancing themselves from him now because they have any real ideological disagreement, but because they realize the writing is on the wall and they're trying to save their own hides. So we'll see. It's definitely different. Communication strategies as well. I can see, for example, Mr. Poilievre often is very aggressive in his communication style. That works when you've got Justin Trudeau as your opponent, but let's just say hypothetically you end up with somebody like Melanie Joly as leader of the Liberal Party. You're going to have to change the way and sort of the strategy that you go after it, because it'll be seen completely different. The target determines in large part the messaging. So there's a lot of things to look out for, but I think the main takeaway here is it's going to be very difficult for whoever the next Liberal leader is to create that necessary distance, I guess you can say, between themselves and Prime Minister Trudeau.
And Kim, Jagmeet Singh today in his news conference was very adamant that when Parliament returns, they're going to support a non-confidence motion. Yep. Of course, just a few months ago, he was not willing to do that when the Conservatives brought one forward. So from your perspective, I guess, A, what changed? But then also, if we're looking at this idea of the next election is likely going to prompt a conservative majority government, will it not be more difficult for the NDP to actually achieve results with a conservative majority government as opposed to the current Liberal minority?
So let's take a step back on a whole bunch of parts of that, which is that there have been an extraordinary amount of things that Jagmeet Singh and the New Democrats have gotten for Canadians. The dental care program, which has helped millions and millions of Canadians access dental care and not clog up the emergency room departments. This was a promise that Liberals had in their platform, out of their platform, in their platform, sort of like everything else Liberals do, in the platform, out of the platform, not at all. But look, Jagmeet decided that these were the things that mattered to Canadians. The pharmacare program, where people are now getting access to birth control and insulin. This is going to make massive differences to people's lives, in particular lower income Canadians. And so these are things that we fought for. There was the GST holiday, which Jagmeet and the New Democrats fought tooth and nail to make sure they got, which surprisingly to me, it was a tax cut that Conservatives couldn't support, even though it helped small businesses and Canadians. But, far be it for me to say, apparently there is a tax cut they won't support. Anyways, so there was a lot of things that Jagmeet Singh and the New Democrats have gotten out of this parliament, gotten for Canadians, knowing full well who they were there for. But there comes a point in time in every relationship, and we've all had those relationships, where we're like, you know what, we're done. We're absolutely done with this. And that is where we're at today. And as the year finished last year, Jagmeet said, we're done. It doesn't matter who the new leader is. If there is a new leader, great, but not having our support. We are going to have a non-confidence vote at the first available opportunity when the House returns, whenever that happens to be. What is fascinating to me, Wyatt, about what it unfolded today with the Prime Minister's announcement, is that it wasn't I'm stepping down immediately. I think there is still a part of the Prime Minister who thinks, well, if they come back sooner, then there is a Liberal Party leadership vote. I can still be the guy. I can still be the guy who saves the Liberal Party and goes into that next election. I saw what Trudeau the first got to do, and he thinks he can somehow gerrymander his way back into that debate stage and that election stage, because he wants that fight. I can't imagine Liberal Party folks will want him to do that. There will be people who will sit on him like a sumo wrestler, but I think there is still a part of him that wants that fight to be had, and he's going to figure out ways to work through that. We'll see when we finally get Liberal Party folks to tell us what their leadership rules will be, but it'll be interesting.
Amanda, is there any, world where that happens, where the Prime Minister can try and, finesse his way into staying?
I don't think that's going to happen. I don't know. I'm not sitting in those rooms, but I don't think that's going to happen. I think that the ship is sailing, if it hasn't already sailed. And I think that leadership contenders who have been considering their vie for leadership are getting organized. And I think that him staying provides some semblance of stability as we head into a truncated leadership race. Remember, the Liberal parties have had traditionally, and it's been over a decade since we've had a leadership race, but they've been longer races where you can really, debate policies and debate ideas. And this is going to be really truncated. At most, we're looking at a couple of months. So while that happens, you want to have stability within the party. So to put an interim leader in place, I think would have been the wrong thing to do. I think it makes a lot of sense for him to stay where he is as the party sorts through this shortened leadership race and gives the candidates as much time as possible to be able to connect with the membership and also start to connect with Canadians at large.
And I guess, Amanda, too, I talked to a Liberal MP earlier in the show, and I asked him kind of just what is behind these poll numbers for the Conservatives that we're seeing. Obviously, they're really high right now, and I guess beyond kind of just the apathy that people are feeling, it's been basically a decade since the Prime Minister was in office. I asked him, how much of it is the result of policies that the Conservatives argue are bad for Canada, things like the carbon tax and, a host of other ones as well. He said he doesn't think that's the case, and I asked this in the best way possible. Is that kind of perhaps the mindset that is causing these low polling numbers for the Liberals right now?
Well, I'm going to give some credit to the Conservatives. I know. But I think, they've had an excellent communication strategy. I think that they've been able to, I don't always agree with it. I have not loved the vitriol. I think that it's put us in a challenging place, but I do think that they've connected with Canadians at a time when Canadians have felt most ill at ease, and those anxieties have been heightened, and they've tapped into it. And I think Poilievre's style has really amplified that. And they were able to also capitalize at a time when incumbent governments are having a very challenging time in convincing Canadians, or convincing, actually all over the world, convincing their voters that they're the right people to continue to lead. We're definitely feeling that change mentality. Now, does a new Liberal leader change that for us? I think that it's too early to tell, and the timeline might frankly be just too short to get us there. But it does change the communication tact from the Conservatives' point of view, for sure. I think it has to. And I also think that it changes, potentially how Canadians view this election as we head into it. The longer the runway, the more likely it is that we can win back some of those votes.
Kim, obviously, let's touch on that, the communication style specifically, because the Conservatives have been really insistent on kind of defining Jagmeet Singh as just an extension of Justin Trudeau. They're one and the same politically, kind of thing. How much is that going to perhaps harm Jagmeet in the election kind of coming up here? And will he have a lot of time to kind of distance himself, seeing as how the election is likely to be in the spring?
Look, I would be shocked if they weren't going after the New Democrats and Jagmeet Singh. What we're seeing across the country, and in particular now that we're seeing polling where the Angus Reid poll at the end of the year had the New Democrats 5 points ahead of the Liberal Party nationwide. Those are unheard of numbers for New Democrats when we get into those nationwide numbers. It showcases the utter collapse of them. And what we know is that when New Democrats started getting into that 21, 23, 25% nationwide numbers, a lot of really interesting things happen in ridings across the country. We look at places like Nanaimo Ladysmith, which is a New Democrat versus Conservative dogfight. Essex, that Windsor to Kitchener-Waterloo corridor, Northern Ontario. In fact, now right across the prairies. And when you look at, for example, the by-election in Winnipeg, where the Liberals got, I think, about 4% of the vote. And it really is a slug fight between the New Democrats and the Conservatives. So you're going to see attacks, for sure. That's just the nature of the politics. You go after who you think your enemies truly are. Reality will be, how much can Mr. Poilievre go beyond, his verbing the noun communication strategy of axing the tax or the thising the that, and as he goes forward, when he has to start showcasing who he is, who his candidates are going to be, and what kind of candidate do they want to bring forward? Because it is so incredibly easy to verb the noun and do the bumper stickers. But now you've also got to become the leader of a G7 nation. And when Canadians start to see who will be that prime minister, who will be those candidates, they're going to have some concerns. And I'm excited about what Jagmeet and the New Democrats are doing across the country. I've seen some of the candidates we have. I talked to the election planning committee folks today about some of our major candidates across the country. And we've got municipal leaders, we've got former MLAs, we've got all sorts of really interesting community builders. And that's going to be really interesting as we get into these neighborhood by neighborhood dogfights.
And Anthony, let me just conclude with you. And just what types of conversations right now are happening in conservative circles? Because obviously the Liberals are trying to rebrand themselves, and while it will be a hard task to do something like that in time for the next election, is there any fear that things might go the other way, or perhaps they might not get as big a victory as the polls? I mean, the polls right now are saying they could win 200 plus seats.
Yeah, and the polls once said that Paul Martin was going to win 200 plus seats back in 2004. And we all know how that all played out. So I can tell you very much, is morale very good in conservative land? Absolutely. And that's not a bad thing per se. But Mr. Poilievre is not prime minister until Mr. Poilievre is prime minister. And until the day where that actually happens, we're going to be treating this like an actual real fight. And that was true, even I can say during the leadership race, even in the dying days when it looked like we were going to win in a landslide. And we did. His mentality and the mentality of the team was head down, keep fighting. It's not over till it's over. Don't count your chickens till they've hatched. And that mentality is every bit still present today and will be up until the very moment the results actually come in and he eventually stands before the Governor General and gets sworn in. So nobody's taking anything for granted. Is there excitement? Is there awareness of the opportunity that seeks on the horizon? 150%, and there should be. But at the end of the day, crazier things have happened, crazier things can happen. And to mail it in at this point would not just be an oversight. I think it would be extremely disrespectful to Canadians and to voters who have yet to make their choice. So feels good, looks good. We still got a long way.
All right, we will leave it there. Amanda, Anthony, and Kim, thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, that's going to do it for the show tonight. We really appreciate you joining us. We'll have continued reaction over the course of this week right here on YouTube, as well